Now we'll start to look more specifically at the Reformation and the church's response to it, the Counter-Reformation. As I'm sure you're aware, Martin Luther really starts the official process of the reform of the church, or calls for the reform of the church, in 1517 when he attaches his 95 Theses to the door of the cathedral where he is serving as an Augustinian monk. Initially, Luther's concerns involve principally the practice of indulgences in the Catholic Church, which is the selling of really sort of selling of forgiveness to people who have sinned, or their relatives, that, you know, you could buy them for yourself, for your relatives, for past sins, for future sins. And basically what you were buying was a little piece of paper that said that you had paid off your sin and would not suffer in purgatory for it. Luther sees this practice of selling indulgences as extremely problematic, sees it as proof of the church having lost its way. The selling of indulgences was a big part of the financing of the Church of St. Peter's as it was being rebuilt, and Luther questions the way that money is being spent in the Catholic Church for the building of churches and their decoration, and you know, all of these questions that he raises. He certainly wasn't the only one that was raising those questions, but he certainly played an incredibly influential role in the development of the Protestant Reformation. He argued that the Bible should be accessible for all people, not just for the learned members of the clergy who could read Latin. And so he worked at translating the Bible into German, the vernacular language of his country, and thereby allowing anyone that could read to be able to read the Bible. He believed as well that the church services should take place in the vernacular language, not in Latin, as they had always been done up to that point. From those issues and others, other men started to question different aspects of the church, including the question of the role of art in churches, whether art was distracting, and they questioned more specifically the representations of the deities in churches and whether the way they were being shown was appropriate or not. They questioned whether the art in the churches served a function any longer, since it now required so much learning to understand. It wasn't serving its original purpose of, you know, explaining the beliefs of the church to those who couldn't read. So there were those issues, and that money was being spent in that way instead of giving money to the poor or for other sorts of charitable works. Another aspect that was questioned by the Protestants was the nature of the host during the Eucharist, and specifically they questioned whether the bread of the Eucharist was symbolic of the body of Christ, or whether it actually became the body of Christ, as the Catholics argued. So that's an important debate as well. We start to see the influence of these questions in Italy, as certainly the church lost some followers to the spread of Protestantism. Protestantism became quickly popular especially in Northern Europe. And it's one of those issues that Charles V is constantly battling against during his reign, and his son will have those same issues as he deals with his control over the Netherlands. But we do start to see the impact of these kind of issues that the Reformation brought to the fore. We saw this fresco in the last lecture of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, and I explained how showing the martyrdom was such an important component of counter-reformatory art, where they really emphasize the roles of the saints and the acts of the saints, the good works of the saints, as a means for personal salvation, but also as in showing models for emulation of, how the saints were willing to sacrifice themselves. So should the Catholics of today as they fight against Protestantism and its spread. Because Protestantism was spreading so quickly, the church got to the point where it could no longer ignore it as it had done for a few decades. And I mean, really all that they had done, Charles V was the one that had proclaimed that Martin Luther was a heretic. And so clearly that was a statement on the part of the emperor and of the church of their refusal of the things that Martin Luther had written. But, the church just sort of keeps going until about 1545, when it's decided it's time to have a serious meeting about how the church needs to formally respond to all of the issues that the Protestants were raising up, and how to bring back these lost souls back to the church, because they had turned to Protestantism instead. So a big meeting is held in the town of Trent in northern Italy, and we call this meeting the Council of Trent. And it lasted from about 1545 to 1563. It's a very long meeting. And we call it the Council of Trent, but it actually traveled around a bit. It wasn't solely in the city of Trent. But it was a gathering together of the clergy as they discussed, the nature of transubstantiation and whether the practice of indulgences was legitimate, and how art should function in the churches, and whether the Mass should stay in Latin or not. And essentially what happens is that the church decides to just double its efforts in all of those regards. It doesn't change a thing, and instead, pushes those ideas even further. Of course, for our purposes, the impact these new ideas, or rather the ideas that the church promotes as part of the Counter-Reformation are, and their impact in art, is what we are really focused on for our class. And here I just want to remind you of what we've seen happen so far in art in the course of the 16th century. We have on the left Raphael with one of his many Madonna and Child paintings that really show nature but beautified, idealized. We have the perfect Virgin Mother and her beautiful baby, and John the Baptist. It's a very straightforward composition, easy to read. The religious figures are obviously elevated to a level of perfection that no human can achieve. In the case of the image on the right, we have one of the altarpieces that Vasari did as he was redecorating the churches in Florence. And in Florence, of course, as we've seen, there's a real emphasis on this late Mannerist or Maniera style. And we can certainly see that, in this painting. It's, these bodies, so nude figures at the bottom, and this kind of spiraling motion of the serpent. And then you have the Virgin who kind of pops out of that spiral and is surrounded by angels. And then you have other figures around here that all relate in some way to the ideas of the Immaculate Conception, which is this long-standing debate within the Church about when the Virgin Mary became immaculate, became free from sin, whether it happened in her mother's womb, whether it happened at her birth, or whether it happened before the beginning of time itself. I talked about this a bit in the very beginning of the classes. We were looking at Leonardo's Madonna of the Rocks, which also has this connection to the Immaculate Conception. Vasari's image, since it's still in this late Mannerist style, is kind of perplexing. Those usual kinds of components of Mannerism that are complicated and require contemplation and some knowledge of the viewer of what exactly they're looking at. The uncomfortable twisting of the bodies, that there's nude bodies in the foreground, and I mean just the complicated nature of these figures that are here. And I mean, obviously it's even depicting a kind of unusual and subject matter with the Virgin rising up full-bodied from and going into heaven. But so a complicated subject matter, certainly, but even Vasari's representation of that subject matter doesn't do what counter-reformatory art is supposed to do, which is to make things as straightforward and understandable as possible for the viewer. So Vasari's image, though it's done right, as the Council of Trent is wrapping up, doesn't yet show the changes that will happen in art to go back to some of the ideas of the High Renaissance into early Christian art that, emphasize the utility of art in explaining things to people. Vasari's is not there yet. It requires, some background knowledge before you can understand what he's showing. You'll remember when we were looking at Michael's Last Judgment that there were lots of nude bodies, and that ultimately they decided to cover up what they saw as being improper or not decorous inclusions of, say, the backsides or the genitals of these religious figures. And that was done right after Michelangelo's death, but also done, because there's such a move in the church to not have nude bodies and have things be more decorous. They start really being concerned about lines of decorum, what's appropriate in a church. And here, I mean, there's this mass of bodies, but I mean, other than that, the subject matter is pretty straightforward because it's a very traditional subject matter. So the issues were really much more with the representations of these saints with these, nude bodies. So we'll see in painting especially how changes are made to the way deities are shown, the way religious figures are shown, the way compositions are structured, and the kinds of subject matter that are more emphasized in the Counter-Reformation period. But to backtrack a little bit to the city of Rome, as we've seen throughout our class, as we've looked at Rome kind of sporadically, that Rome was undergoing a great deal of rebuilding, and it had really been undergoing rebuilding since about 1450. And the sack of Rome that happened in 1527 really set things back a bit, and it still needed a great deal of rebuilding and just didn't look like the capital of the Catholic Church. And especially during the Counter-Reformatory period, it's, the Catholic Church sees that it's more important than ever to build up the way that the city looks and have its churches and in general its presence in Rome really be emphasized and obvious and be symbolic of the power that the church has not only in Rome but well beyond Rome throughout Europe. Even in 1535, when Heemskerk visits from Northern Europe and does a series of sketches of the things that he sees around Rome, you can see, I mean, this is the area of St. Peter's, and it's still in construction. It doesn't look like the head church of Catholicism, and so that needed attention. Here's some other images that Heemskerk did. You have the area of the ruins, and in some of the images he shows, there are like cows grazing along the Capitoline Hill or whatever. I mean, things were just not in good shape. By 1590, things were, a lot of things are happening in the city, and it really is a response to the Counter-Reformation and rebuilding of the city, making it look like the capital. And the popes really spend a lot of energy and labor and money, of course, in doing things like urban planning. They straighten the streets and widen some of the streets. They reconstruct some of the ancient aqueducts that had gone into disrepair and were, because of their disrepair, were really limiting the good water supply in Rome. And they construct fountains to celebrate the arrival of water from those repaired aqueducts. They do some rebuilding of some of the ancient churches of Rome and make new churches as well. They require that all of the cardinals have residences in the city, and so all of these cardinals are building palaces and decorating them. So there's a great deal of building activity in Rome. I mean, really throughout the 16th century, but it really accelerates after the Council of Trent. Here's some of the map from 1625 that shows you just how packed in all of these buildings are by the time you get to the second decade of the 1600s. So we've already looked at the building that's happening at St. Peter's, and we looked at it most recently as we were looking at Michelangelo and his plan for the church, the building of the dome, and some of the other areas of the sides of St. Peter's. So St. Peter's is really starting to take shape by the time you get to the 1560s, and really a lot of progress is made by the time you get to 1600. And of course, this is the final product of all of that building. A lot of this that you see today happens, though, during the Baroque period. The facade is finished around 1564. Probably goes a bit later than that, however. I'm thinking it really ends in like 1590, so I'm not really sure why this date is here. But then you've also got these arms that come out from the building. Those were done by Bernini, and those happen around the halfway point of the 1600s. And he also is responsible for the sculptures that are on top of this colonnade. So a lot of what we see today comes from the Baroque period, and it's all because of this emphasis on making this church be the most impressive, most overwhelming, powerful looking church in all of the Western world, which surely it still can make claim to that. As you'll read about in the textbook, there were some particularly influential writers that discussed how art should look and the utility of art in churches. And Gabriele Paleotti and Carlo Borromeo are certainly among the most important of those writers. And once those writings start to circulate, they have a pretty immediate impact on artists and their patrons. And we start to see those effects, and a dramatic change in style takes place. We're going to look at two artists that show two different sort of responses to the new ideas of the Catholic Church in terms of its imagery. And those two artists are Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio. Annibale Carracci was working in Bologna, and in Bologna he would have had access to a few paintings by Raphael, and we know that Raphael was an important influence for him. And we know that he traveled and saw the paintings by several artists that we've looked at for this class, Titian and Correggio. Those artists have a great impact on him, and you can understand why. You can really see those influences in his paintings. We're looking here on the left at a painting called The Apparition of the Virgin, and you have these two saints who are witnessing or having this vision of the Virgin. Visions are an important tool of counter-reformatory art. They're a popular subject. And artists are, throughout the Baroque period, thinking about new ways to communicate the idea of these holy visions. The idea was that if you prayed hard enough, if you were dedicated enough to the teachings of the church, that you could experience these visions like saints experienced. And here these two saints are gesturing upward. They have one arm that comes out towards the viewer and then one arm that gestures upward, so that, we're meant to understand that we are experiencing along with them this vision of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child up in heaven. So that idea of the vision of the viewer and holy visions is a really important part of Baroque art. Caravaggio approaches it in a different way, but it is why those ceiling paintings by Correggio are so influential to Baroque artists, because they start trying to make the interior of the church really act like a kind of theater, in a way that the worshiper goes in and sees these illusions in the ceiling and believes that they're looking directly at heaven itself and having these heavenly visions just like saints had had. In comparing these two paintings, this one by Carracci and one by Raphael, you can see in comparing these two that we get that same idea of vision. We've got the two angels here that are leaning on what's meant to look like a sort of windowsill. And then we have two saints that are showing us this vision of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child. So very similar to what Carracci does. And you can see the influence of Raphael in the way that the figures are shown. These are not Mannerist figures by any means. They are returned to looking at the human figure and studying it firsthand and then improving on it. So that same concept of Raphael of, making these ideal religious figures. Annibale Carracci, like Leonardo and Michelangelo, and like Raphael to some extent, is heavily dependent on the study of the human figure and uses many, many preliminary drawings before he starts to paint. This is quite different from what we'll see Caravaggio doing. So he really believes in this very academic approach to art of study and lots of preparatory drawings and then painting. One painting that we know Carracci would have seen firsthand is Santa Cecilia with Saints, which you see here, which was in Bologna when Carracci was there, and he certainly studied it. And we can see how Carracci uses Raphael's approach to the figure and these perfect forms and these beautiful settings and that sort of thing. So Carracci works in Bologna for the start of his career and then is called to Rome to work in Palazzo Farnese and do a series, mythological series for the ceiling of this room in this palace. Carracci would also have been brought to Rome to do religious paintings and portraits, and he also had started doing genre paintings of scenes of everyday life, which was a new type of painting that evolves at the end of the 16th century. What we see him doing here is thinking about the ceiling and devising it much in the same way that Michelangelo had done, so that it's a series of separated out elements that have some kind of framing element. And you even have nude figures that are with what are meant to look like sculpted figures along the framework, which, kind of ties in with Michelangelo, as does these medallions with these nude figures around them. So some real similarities with what Michelangelo had done in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And you can see the correlation here. What Carracci aims to do is not merely replicate Michelangelo, and he certainly borrows from Michelangelo in a different way than the Mannerist artist did. He looks at Michelangelo, he is inspired by his treatment of the figure, by his color, and by the way that he's organized the ceiling. But what Carracci hopes to do, in his own words, is to give even greater vivacity to these painted figures, make them seem even more full of life than what Michelangelo had done. So, the figures are meant to be less statuesque in a way. They're meant to really look and behave like real humans as they move through space. And he achieves that through his approach to modeling and to the sense of light that he creates in his paintings. Another interesting aspect of Carracci's ceiling is that, he's really into this illusion. And again, it's because he's looking at Correggio and seeing Correggio's ceilings in Parma and elsewhere, and certainly looking at the Sistine Chapel ceiling as well. And he creates this series of illusions. For one thing, and he wants you to notice what these illusions are, like the human figure in front of this beautiful sculpted figure. You're supposed to enjoy the contrast of painting versus sculpture, and it plays on that idea of the paragone. And his sculpted forms seem full of life as well, actually. They seem animated. And if you zoom in, you can see that he's even made little cracks in the figures so that it looks like the cracks of stone or stucco. And all of that is purely fictive. He's just done that to make it look older or make it look, more like the material he's trying to emulate. Here's the central scene, which is the triumph of the gods. You have these panthers that are pulling the chariot of Bacchus, and we have Ariadne over here, and all sorts of festivities taking place with these various figures. It's all parallel to the picture plane, and so he certainly has not moved away from that. We don't get a sense of looking at the figures from below. Instead, it looks like individual paintings that have been done and then stuck onto the ceiling in their frames. So it's not that kind of illusionistic painting that Correggio was doing. It's more like what Michelangelo was doing in these painted panel approach. Of course, he would have known of these fresco cycles around Rome. So not only the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but also the cycle that Raphael and his students did in the Villa Farnesina. He certainly knew. And borrows some elements from Raphael, like the organization of the composition, and even some of the positionings of these figures you can find, they're almost their twins in Carracci's painting. So really trying to get it back to the glory days of high Renaissance painting and moving away from mannerism. So the other big artist is Caravaggio, and Caravaggio you've probably heard about. He's one of those kind of romanticized artists. He led a violent life and has such an interesting biography that he's attracted a lot of attention, both from scholars but also from non-specialists. There are several historical fiction novels about Caravaggio's life. He's truly a fascinating guy, and you'll be watching one of the National Gallery lectures about Caravaggio and his very exciting biography, so I won't say any more about that here. Caravaggio is his nickname. His real name is Michelangelo Merisi, but he came from the town of Caravaggio and just sort of ended up going by his town name. Caravaggio is a town in Lombardy, and so he certainly knew painting of northern Italy, Milan in particular, and knew of Leonardo's work there. And he certainly knew Correggio's paintings in Parma and Titian, and we know that he traveled around and saw stuff. But Caravaggio really tries to be different from his predecessors. He doesn't try to emulate them in such a clear way as Annibale Carracci does. Instead, he really tries to do things differently and pushes the boundaries sometimes of decorum, especially in a climate in Rome that was increasingly rejecting or sort of insisting upon more rigid controls and definitions of decorum. So that ended up being more than problematic for Caravaggio. In fact, I should say that, though Caravaggio is probably more known to you than Annibale Carracci is, the reality is that Annibale Carracci was much more successful in Baroque Rome than Caravaggio was by a long shot. But Caravaggio's style appeals to us, and he appealed to later generations of artists in a way that Annibale Carracci didn't. And so, in a way, he has kind of enjoyed greater popularity several decades after his death than he did while he was alive. When Caravaggio moves to Rome, he's still a young man and trains there for a while with an artist that's also from Lombardy, and then breaks off and decides to forge ahead with an independent career. He does several self-portraits as a way to practice. Yourself is a much cheaper model than hiring someone else. He's looking into a mirror and trying out different facial expressions and studying the way that has an effect on your face and how to hold your body in different positions. He experiments with different sorts of lighting effects. And we see him doing that in these many self-portraits he creates, especially in the course of the 1590s. He also does what are called genre paintings, so paintings of scenes from everyday life. This is one of those paintings called The Card Sharps. And in it we see some aspects that will become his trademarks, really. This bright light on the figures, very little sense of background setting, and figures that are done in a highly realistic style with their wrinkles and dirty fingers and tattered clothes. And, he's certainly not trying to show us a picture of perfection. What we see here is this young, elegantly dressed boy who is being tricked. He's playing cards and with these guys who are cheating. We see this guy pulling a card out of his back pocket and this guy looking over his shoulder and gesturing to this guy so he knows what cards he's holding. So we're seeing a scene where this guy is being duped. These become popular painting subjects, and Caravaggio paints them especially for a cardinal who becomes one of his greatest patrons, the Cardinal del Monte in Rome. Some details. Caravaggio is really good at giving us a variety of textures like the fabric and then the iron of the dagger here, the paper of the card. You can see this guy's got some dirty looking nails, and Caravaggio loves those kinds of seedy details like that. This, just because I didn't show you previously, is a painting by Carracci that's also a genre scene. And this is just a type of subject matter that becomes popular and really begins in Northern Europe and just makes its way down to Italy. Caravaggio does still life paintings, but his still life paintings are different from what we see in other painters. We have a basket here that's sitting very precariously on this ledge, and if you look closely you'll see that some of the fruit has started to go bad. So it's never perfect nature. It's always like the ugly side of nature, and he was highly innovative for depicting those aspects. Caravaggio's perceived lack of decorum got him into trouble in several instances. And the trouble really shows us what this climate of Rome was like in this counter-reformatory period. Caravaggio was asked to do a series of paintings for a chapel in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi. And the original commission was for a cycle of paintings about St. Matthew. It's supposed to be one altarpiece and then two side paintings that all dealt with St. Matthew. And Caravaggio paints this altarpiece, which you see here, and it is initially rejected by the patrons. Why would this painting be rejected? St. Matthew, we see seated and is working on writing the gospel. The angel leans on him and takes his hand and seems to be helping him move his hand to do the writing. We see the legs of St. Matthew come out at the viewer. In fact, we even see the underside of his left foot. And there's something about the way that his face has been shown, this kind of expression on his face, that people of the church felt like was kind of denigrating. It looked like he wasn't very smart. It also looked like he wasn't very smart if he had to have this angel basically write the thing for him. The nude legs were seen as questionable. Seeing the underside of the sturdy foot was questionable. And then this kind of overly intimate connection between the angel and St. Matthew was also deemed inappropriate. So this painting was rejected. We see it in black and white here because unfortunately this painting was lost during World War II. It actually survived until then, but was lost in World War II. So the second version for this altarpiece that Caravaggio creates is what you see here on your right. And it's the painting that's still in the chapel. And here we see St. Matthew, who is more appropriately covered up. And he is busy writing, but takes a break and looks up and sees this angel swooping down, who is counting out arguments that St. Matthew needs to include in the gospel. So this suggests more that St. Matthew listens to the angel who's communicating the word of God and then translates that word and takes a more active approach than the very passive way that we see him in the first version of the painting. Caravaggio, being Caravaggio, also always has to throw something in there that's daring, and in this case I think it's this stool that seems to be getting ready to fall off the side here. Why he would include that, I don't know. It's just, a way to throw things off balance, make it a little more visually interesting, perhaps. In this same chapel, he painted The Calling of St. Matthew. And this is perhaps one of Caravaggio's best known paintings, where we have the figure of Peter and Christ as they come into what appears to be a tavern and calls Matthew and ask him to follow Christ and become one of the apostles. Matthew is a banker and has been sitting at the table counting money, and we can see that that's what these guys are all involved in. There are a number of aspects of this that are so perfectly Caravaggesque. The lighting with this broad sort of spotlight that comes in and lights the figures and leads us in the narrative. The pockets of dark shadow that include even the body of Christ, which we really don't see here at all, and the bottom half of St. Peter really cloaked in shadow. Also dark areas on this side of the composition and obviously under the table as well. The inclusion of these figures that are dressed like people you would see at the turn of the century in Rome, So they're dressed in contemporary dress, though Peter and Christ are not, which is kind of interesting. So it's not archaeologically accurate, which will become a more important factor in religious art as the Counter-Reformation continues. Caravaggio has included this setting, which really does look like a tavern. In fact, it looks like any tavern in early 17th century Rome. And then the people dressed in contemporary clothing as a way to make the painting as accessible as possible to the viewer. And this is one of those ideas that correlates with the ideas of the Counter-Reformation in making the viewer relate to the figures and making the subject matter very clear, which I think Caravaggio does a great job with. There's not all of that confusion of Mannerist painting. All of that is gone. One thing I should say that I didn't mention earlier is that Caravaggio has a very different approach to painting than Annibale Carracci does. His is not an academic approach. He does not do preliminary sketches. He paints directly on the surface, and instead of studying the figure and replicating it on the canvas, his approach was to walk around Rome, see people, kind of keep it in his mind, and then go back and paint from memory. The Carracci really, saw this as not being academic and, not showing the skill or intellect required for a painter, but that was Caravaggio's approach. This is the other painting in the same chapel, and this is of the martyrdom of St. Matthew. So again, we have this martyrdom scene, and we just really start to see a lot of these martyrdom scenes in counter-reformatory painting because they emphasize that sacrifice and that dedication to the faith. We see in this moment that Matthew has fallen to the ground. The executioner is here holding one of his arms and getting ready to cut the neck of Matthew. We have an angel who's come down and is offering the palm of martyrdom to him. And then we have these figures who seem to react in a number of ways. Some of them are dressed as contemporary Romans and others are not. And in this case, quite interestingly, we have this guy looking at the scene from afar, and this is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio, so he's included himself in here as a sort of signature. As we've already seen with the other paintings by Caravaggio we've looked at, there are areas of bright light and then pockets of darkness, and this is even more evident when you're in the chapel. He's actually using the window of the chapel as the light source, and so in doing that kind of blurs the lines between what is painted and what is the result of this natural light of the chapel, and in that way is creating this same kind of vision idea that I talked about previously. The Carracci and Caravaggio, or Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio actually collaborated on a project, and that was for the Chirazi Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. And so this idea of having them compete in the same space was an attractive one in the same way that it had been for Leonardo and Michelangelo in Palazzo Vecchio for their patrons. This is what the three paintings ended up looking like. You have this these two by Caravaggio, and then the central painting by Annibale Carracci. So even though their styles were quite different, the patron clearly didn't have an issue of having them come together in one space. But I won't go into these any further as they're more appropriately covered in a course on Baroque art. And I think you've gotten the gist anyway of what these two strains are like between Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio. And that's pretty much where we need to end things for our class.